right. Welcome, everybody. Glad to see a full room here at the Ream Library. That's always nice. It's very exciting. So welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's lecture. My name is Peter Fritz, and I'll be introducing our speaker on behalf of the director of the McFarland Center, Professor Tom Landy, who is traveling currently. I am a professor in the Department of Religious Studies. Today's lecture is being hosted by the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, as well as initiatives to foster Jewish-Christian understanding and to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. For today's event, the McFarland Center is partnering with the Ethics Society and Institution of Business minor here at the college. The ESIB program invites students to explore the role of business in a just, flourishing, and sustainable society, which perhaps today more than ever we have to imagine before we can inhabit it. So thank you to Brent Otto, SJ, Ruby Francis from the McFarland Center for helping to organize tonight's event. Our speaker today is Chrystin Ondersma. Professor Ondersma is professor of law and Judge Morris Stern Scholar at Rutgers Law School, where she teaches courses on bankruptcy and commercial law. She earned her JD at Harvard Law School, where she studied under then professor and now senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. At Harvard, Warren sparked Professor Ondersma's interest in household debt policy, and the injustice that it often encodes. Professor Ondersma has directed her passion for justice into her legal work and teaching, and into her recently published book, Dignity, Not Debt, an abolitionist approach to economic justice. This book sets forth a new taxonomy of household debt, aimed at understanding what sort of debt American households take on, why, and which barriers to economic inclusion are baked into practices and policies surrounding debt. Professor Ondersma makes the case that human dignity demands new understandings, practices, and policies surrounding debt in order to extirpate exclusion, to resist unjust wealth extraction, and to foster justice. The title of today's lecture is Mainstreaming Debt Resistance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chrystin Ondersma.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, it's so nice to see you all. Thank you so much for having me. All right, so today I am going to tell you about this book that I've written, and then I'm going to tell you what I think is wrong with it and what I'm working on now. Right, so in this book, Dignity, Not Debt, I argue that the principle of human dignity rather than profits should guide policymakers, and that our collective goal should be to end both what I call survival debt and what I call extractive debt. I'll describe those more in a moment. Extractive debt being predatory debt that benefits lenders and collectors but actually tends to harm borrowers. My current project argues for the necessity of creative and strategic debt resistance in the face of structures that will not give us the things that we need to survive. Okay. Before I flesh out these ideas, I want to give you a little background on just some things going on with the U.S. household debt landscape. First of all, there's two things that I just read today. One is that soon 1 in 8 Americans won't be able to get food because SNAP benefits are getting cut off, right? 4 in 10 Americans between the ages of 18 to 29, looks like most of you, say that they are barely getting by. So that's 40% of youth, between 18, not youth, but 18 to 29-year-olds that are really struggling to make ends meet. 40% of Americans do not have an extra $400 if they have an emergency. So guess what they have to do when something happens? If their child gets sick, they get into a car accident, they have to turn to debt. If they lose a job, right? 1 out of every 3 adult Americans has a debt that has been turned over to a collection agency. 70% of American adults indicated it would be somewhat difficult or very difficult if their paycheck was delayed for a week. At the time of this writing, we've got over $1.8 trillion in student loans outstanding. And right now, 1 out of 3 federal student loan borrowers who is supposed to be repaying is at risk of default. So Americans are really not relying on debt to buy luxuries. There's this myth that, go out and buy fancy things and then just file for bankruptcy and abuse the system, blah, blah, blah. That is simply not the reality. Americans who are indebted because they are trying to survive. Often, the debt that they have to take on comes with extremely onerous terms. And of course, the most at risk and the most marginalized Americans end up having the least access to decent credit, right? So they may have to do something like take out a payday loan, which can have an interest rate of over 1,000%. The average payday loan swallows 36% of a borrower's pre-tax paycheck. So you can imagine the people that are getting payday loans already are not earning very much, and then that's a very big chunk to come out of their check. Many Americans, in fact, half of all Americans carry medical debt, and more than half of those with medical debt owe at least $1,000 in medical debt. The more that households struggle, the more lenders profit. I don't know if you know this, but lenders don't really make a lot of money especially credit card companies do not make money when borrowers pay their bills every month on time. They make money off of the people that are struggling and cannot pay their bills on time and end up paying a lot in interest, default fees, and so forth and so on. Black and other marginalized families are disproportionately targeted with predatory loan products and disproportionately targeted with collection actions. Even controlling for income, judgments from debt collectors are nearly twice as high in Black communities as in white communities. The consequences of defaulting on debt can be quite harsh. Wages can be garnished, cars repossessed, houses foreclosed upon. But also, I don't know if you know this, but thousands of Americans are actually behind bars right now because of an inability to pay a private debt. It's supposed to be unconstitutional. U.S. Constitution and human rights obligations prohibit the incarceration of somebody because they cannot pay a debt. But in fact, people end up in jail through procedural reasons because failure to show up at court, even if they have no notice of the court date, they can get contempt of court order and then end up in jail. All right. Our household debt policies right now are really rooted in myths. There are a lot of barriers. First of all, the fact that people have to turn to debt to survive is a big problem. But there are also barriers to debt relief. And the barriers are there because of this myth that households are taking on debt strategically, abusively, and that we just have, rational actors making rational choices in a free market. So, there are restrictions on debt relief with this assumption, right, that people who are in debt and who are seeking bankruptcy are just behaving strategically. We don't have a free market. I'm sorry to say, sorry to burst your bubble, those of you who thought we did, but it is not the free market that determines who has the most wealth and who has the most debt, and who needs to rely on debt in order to meet their basic needs or gain an opportunity. The distribution of wealth and debt in this country is the result of explicit policy choices that the government has made, not just private discrimination, although private discrimination also plays a role. You can go back, all the way back to the Homestead Act, in which the government gave away many millions of acres to white households. And in fact, hundreds of millions of families today who have property because they were descended from this land giveaway back in the 1800s. Also, the Fair Housing Act, which was what allowed many white families to get homes and wealth and become part of the middle class, that was explicitly limited in many cases to white borrowers. These are official government policies, not private discrimination. This is important. All right. We had, of course, the financial collapse in 2008. Most borrowers have lost their homes in the financial crisis. Not most, but disproportionately many white families also lost their homes, but the black borrowers who were targeted for predatory loans and who lost their homes, they lost much more equity than white households did. All right, so in summary, so far, many households have no choice but to take on debt to survive. Households are encouraged and then expected to take on debt in order to pursue opportunities, also like education and homes. And then they are punished based on this myth that they have abused the system. All right. So there is a real disconnect between our household debt policies and the reality of household debt. So when I wrote my book, I said, well, economic efficiency is a lie, so let's not pretend like that's what we have going on. Let's pick a new guiding principle for our debt policies. And I thought, well, human dignity seems to be the best we can do. I'm no longer so sure I think that, but that's what we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's what I came up with. The reason that I chose human dignity was that, free market efficiency has stubbornly held on as sort of our guiding principle for rhetorical reasons as much as anything else, right? It's something that is easy to understand. It's sort of universally comprehensible. So if we're going to replace it, it has to be something that at least is that we should have a shared understanding of what this means. And I thought human dignity would be a good candidate because we have human rights, which is all around the globe, right? And of course, it's not perfect, but the same way that if people can disagree on what efficiency means, there might be different definitions, but it is something that people talk about and that is used in other contexts, right? And it is actually linked also to specific human rights obligations. I also thought that the most successful period of expanding our economic policy, economic security for households, although primarily for white households, happened under FDR with the Four Freedoms speech, which prioritized human dignity as a guiding principle. So that this has been used in U.S. history before as a principle to do things differently. So why not that? So what am I talking about when I say human dignity? Well, we can go back to Kant, who talks about a worth above all price, which is held only insofar as the thing in question is not a means to a further end, but rather an end in itself. I cite a bunch of other philosophers, Nussbaum, Waldron, Kilmister, Bernstein, but I'm short on time, so I just want to share my favorite thinker about human dignity. Francia Marquez, Colombia's new vice president, the first female and Afro-Caribbean vice president who popularized this phrase, vivir sabroso, which basically means to live deliciously. It means something like to live richly and with dignity, she said. That's her definition of it. She says to live with dignity, to live in peace, to live with guaranteed rights, to live without fear, and to live with joy. So, for example, she said that somebody asked her, okay, now you have your vice presidential home, now can you live with dignity? And she says, well, I had already a dignified home before that. It's not that. It was that racism, classism, and threats of violence were interfering with my right to vivir sabroso. And she also described that it's not money that you need in order to vivir sabroso, right? She's like, my community, if they could have their land and if they could fish, and they were free from threats of violence, they could vivir sabroso, right? So it's not having an increased income, it's having access to land and resources. Some of you in the capitalism class, right? So, I have some land in Vermont, but nobody can come there and cut down firewood to stay warm or kill a rabbit and eat the rabbit, right? Because we have trespassing laws. Some places, by the way, you can roam on other people's property and you can make firewood and collect berries and get whatever food happens to be there. We don't have that in the States. So it's hard here to get by without having to work, blah, blah, blah. This is a whole nother talk. Okay, so vivir sabroso. we can think of that as a standard of living. If I'm talking about human dignity, what human dignity requires, and what vivir sabroso requires, let's say a standard of living consistent with human dignity is one in which individuals can meet their needs and live life without degradation and fear. And I was going to say one more thing about dignity to you all, because some of you have also believe, right, that we have a creator who created us in the Creator's image. So if we are, I kind of love this and want to include this in dignity, is that if Kant, right, is going back to, we're made in God's image. If God is a creator and we're creators, then we have to have the capacity to be creators. So if we cannot meet our basic needs without surviving, that interferes with our capacity to be creative, curious, playful beings, right, as our creator. Just a thought on that, which I think Francia Marquez's Vivir Sabroso also captures, right? That we need to have joy and we need to be able to be creative. All right. What would our household landscape look like with human dignity as our North Star for policymaking? How are we going to decide what type of credit to encourage and what to discourage or abolish? I'm going to offer 3 core tenets arising from a respect for human dignity. First of all, I'm going to say that each person should be able to meet their needs and enjoy life without degradation and fear. Second, I'm going to say respect for human dignity requires that no person be treated as a means to another's end. No one should have to incur debt that benefits only someone other than themselves. Third, I believe that human dignity requires true equality, not just equal treatment, but a redistribution of power, wealth, and resources to ensure equal dignity for all. The first core tenet, creating conditions under which each person can achieve a standard of living consistent with human dignity, calls for an abolitionist approach to survival debt because it interferes with one's ability to access housing, food, clothing, and care without degradation or fear. The second core tenet, that no person should be used as a means to another's end, calls for an abolitionist approach to extractive debt, I believe. Extractive debt are defined as predatory debt that primarily benefits someone other than the borrower and is substantially likely to harm the borrower. This includes predatory high-cost loans, often concentrated in marginalized communities. Examples include payday loans, subprime home equity loans, and high-cost education loans. Extractive debt, as I will use it, also includes debt intended to acquire a resource or opportunity that in fact lacks any substantial value. Such as a car that is a lemon or a home that is falling apart and will require more funds to repair and maintain than the value it will ultimately provide. Or a degree that will not be likely to transfer into a living wage, right? So some for-profit colleges, for example, they're very expensive but don't translate into work. Also, extractive debt includes municipal fines and fees that have a primarily revenue-generating purpose. For example, the city of Chicago's use of parking fines. The third core tenet that I have here, true equality, suggests the need for a category of debt I will call opportunity debts. Opportunity debt, as I will call it, is debt incurred to acquire additional resources, assets, or opportunities. Conditions of true equality are dependent upon the allocation, distribution, and acquisition of wealth, resources, and opportunities. Therefore, a taxonomy of debt centered around a respect for human dignity and the equality it demands must be cognizant of the way in which debt does or does not relate to the expansion of resources and opportunities. So what I'm arguing for there is a reparative approach. Yes, I believe that we cannot have true equality without reparations, and I believe otherwise we will continue to entrench inequality. All right. I want to focus for a moment on this abolitionist approach that I have come up with to extractive debt and survival debt. So I believe if we are centering human dignity as a guiding principle, that survival debt and extractive debt, our aim should be to make both survival debt and extractive debt obsolete. So I draw on, actually, the abolitionist work, prison abolitionists, grassroots organizations such as Critical Resistance. Under an abolitionist approach to considering various household debt proposals, I think that questions we should ask include, does this policy reduce reliance on debt as a means for survival? Does this policy challenge the notion that debt is a solution to poverty and inequality? Does this policy reduce the scale of credit-based dispossession? Okay, what would an abolitionist approach to survival debt look like? It's so frustratingly obvious because it feels so unachievable right now. But other countries manage to do this. Specifically, most of Scandinavia manages to provide its citizens with affordable housing, affordable education, transit, basic medical care, all of these things, right? And they do this by, taxing people, wealthy people mostly, enough to pay for these things. It is possible to do this. It's not like we don't have wealth in this country. And what's interesting is you sit down with Norwegians, and they definitely have ideological differences. On immigration, for example, there's a right wing in Norway, sure, but never would you meet somebody in Norway that was like, yeah, you know what, we would like to have the United States healthcare system. That would be much better than what we have, right? No one wants that, and no one wants colleges that cost what they cost here. One of my Norwegian friends told me the story about a friend of hers who'd been unemployed, homeless, and drug addicted. The city government got her housing, got her into treatment, and got her clean, and got her some training to become a nurse. So now she's a nurse. You would not see that here. We don't. And so it's very infuriating because it's like the solutions are there, but we're not doing that here. All right. Real quick, abolitionist approach to extractive debt. I'm going to just say that that is not possible without abolishing survival debt. The idea that, we can just have better financial education and more regulation of these, so we can just get rid of predatory loans. No. As long as people need debt to survive, there will always be extractive debt because the companies that make these loans can dance around regulation so easily. They have very fancy lawyers and economists, and they know how to craft something around regulation. Financial education won't do jack shit. I'm sorry to use that language. But the problem is that people who need debt to survive, right, they will have to take on debt on any terms offered. So there was one study of payday loan recipients. Remember, I told you 1,000% interest. They said, okay, if you had more information, would you have chosen differently? And more than a third of them said they would have taken that loan on any term offered because they just have no choice. If your kid is sick, you're going to take on that loan no matter what. So financial education as a solution is nonsense. It's not that people need education. They need to be able to afford their basic needs. All right. Also, I think that if we prioritize regulating extractive debt, then that can give us the illusion that debt is safe and that turning to debt for survival needs is an acceptable way for a society to function. It's not. Nobody should have to take on debt to survive. All right, now, why do I hate my book now? I don't hate it. It's just, you guys look at what's happening. They are never going to give us these things. So one day I was having coffee with my wife and I was just like on the verge of tears. This is so stupid. I've been teaching bankruptcy for 15 years and I've been telling everyone how, don't worry, we're not using debt strategically. We're just using debt for survival. We're actually ethical people making good choices. We just have no choice but taking on debt to survive. We're not doing anything wrong. We're not doing anything wrong. So please give us health care. Please give us affordable education. Please, 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 just begging policymakers to give us these things. I'm sorry. And it's like, this is not fair. It's not fair because guess what? You know who's acting strategically are the wealthy Americans and corporations. They are acting strategically, right? So now, what I'm trying to say is that, guess what? We don't have a choice. We're going to have to get creative and we're going to have to get strategic, right? So my plan right now is to try to evangelize to everyone that if you need debt to survive, take it. And guess what? The United States doesn't give you very much at all in terms of resources, but we get the right to file for bankruptcy every 8 years. And so anybody who needs debt to survive should not be afraid to take on debt to survive and should not be ashamed to ask for that relief, right? We need to take measures into our own hands, and we need to use debt relief to force redistribution. Now, shame and fear prevent many Americans from seeking debt relief. I started thinking about this. Also, I hang out with a lot of anarchists and queer punks, and they have long known that it's a mistake to rely on institutions. They're like, yeah, hello. When I told them this, they're like, we've been telling you this. They have been organizing for collective debt resistance. There's the Debt Collective, Strike Debt, Building Power and Creating Resources ever since the 2008 housing crash and financial crisis. There's organizers like Dean Spade, who have long argued that our time and energy is better spent building mutual aid than urging policymakers for reform. So, if activists are already mobilized to strategize around debt, what am I hoping to contribute here as an actual law professor still, for now? We have law schools for the time being. Law, sort of, not really, but whatever. What am I hoping to contribute here? Basically, I have two goals. First, I want to help those with limited resources feel empowered and even excited to strategize around debt relief. And second, I would like to persuade my fellow academics, judges, trustees, those who still have power in institutions to really think expansively and creatively about our opportunities to strategize and help others strategize around debt and debt relief. I do not believe anymore that our institutions are going to save us. But they can still serve us, especially our bankruptcy courts. Most of us are going to have to interact with formal systems at some point in the foreseeable future. You may have no choice again but to take on debt. People have to go to schools. People have to go to hospitals. People will be sued in state courts. And bankruptcy courts, again, still offer the best place for relief for many Americans. Even if your ultimate goal is to live off-grid, independent from the government, you may still want to leverage financial tools to create that life. And to the extent that these legal tools are available, we should not let the wealthy be the only ones to take advantage of them. The biggest hurdle that I have, I think, there's two hurdles to convincing people that it's okay to take on debt and not repay it. There's fear and shame. With fear, there's good reasons also sometimes to be somewhat afraid, because obviously the things that can happen, like I said, you can, if you don't pay attention to what's going on, you could actually end up in jail. So you do have to know how to handle debt. You can't just take it on and then forget about it. You have to know how to resist, right? And you have to know what the consequences are of non-payment, and you have to be able to strategize. There's something called the Debt Resisters Operations Manual. If anybody has anybody that's struggling with debt, I encourage you to look at it. You can just Google it, Debt Resisters Operations Manual. It gives you sort of step-by-step on many different types of debt. Basically, don't ignore it, just object. I don't owe it, you can't prove it. I don't owe it, you can't prove it. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Okay? All right, it's their burden of proof. And most debt collectors don't actually have any right to collect. They can't prove they own the debt. They can't, most debt buyers. All right, fear. So we can be honest about the risks and benefits, and sometimes also fears are overblown. People often really freak out about what it's going to do to your credit score. Many people who are in a situation like that, their credit score is already messed up, and also people sometimes overvalue what they need your credit score for. If you already have stable housing and you've got the car that you need, you probably don't need a good credit score anytime in the future. If you're paying your credit card bill off every month, what does it matter what the interest rate is? So some people, obviously if you're going to need to buy a house sometime soon, you want to keep your credit score good. If you already have a house, you have stable housing already, it's not as important. All right. Shame, though. All right, overcoming shame. People still feel so ashamed about not repaying their debt. How am I going to deal with this? All right, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why no one should be ashamed to have or to discharge debt. First, corporations and rich people use debt and bankruptcy strategically all the time. Second, financial institutions, medical institutions are unjustly enriched at taxpayer expense. Third, Americans have long been denied government help on the grounds that economic efficiency, or the free market, is going to yield the best results. And guess what? discharging debt is often the efficient choice. I just went through a whole thing about we shouldn't use efficiency, but as long as they're still going to say economic efficiency, we can say, well, hey, if that's what you think, then I'm just doing efficient thing, right? Okay, so I'm going to take these things in turn. I think I still have like 15 minutes, yeah, so I'll tell you. First of all, wealthy people and corporations do this, while Americans with few resources have no choice but to turn to debt to survive. Americans with ample resources use debt all the time as a wealth enhancer. Anybody heard of the buy, borrow, die strategy? Something that wealthy Americans do to avoid paying income taxes. They take on debt to pay for their living expenses so that they don't have to use income. And it's a known strategy, and that way they don't have to pay taxes. Okay, so that's just one example. What about deciding not to repay? Melissa Jacoby, in her book Unjust Debts, chronicles the way that corporations and wealthy individuals get much greater benefits from the bankruptcy system than the average human being struggling to get by. We do not question corporations who enter bankruptcy in order to do better. So if the wealthy and the powerful are the only ones to make use of the legal tools that help them keep their wealth, inequality is only going to get worse. All right, so that's reason number one. We cannot, people who are struggling cannot be the only ones to not use debt strategically. Also, financial institutions and this is reason number two. Financial institutions and medical institutions are unjustly enriched at taxpayer expense. The government could fairly tax financial institutions and medical institutions and the debt industrial complex and then use those resources to help Americans meet their basic needs or get through emergencies. But since they are not doing that, we are going to have to do a redistribution ourselves. All right. We already paid our fair share, basically. Think of financial crisis 2008, big bailout, right? That was a lot of taxpayer money. The banks and financial institutions still enjoy considerable government support, taxpayer-funded support, and a substantial portion of their equity, their profits, as much as 16%, according to some studies, comes from the fact that everybody knows that if a big bank fails, taxpayers will bail them out. So thanks to you and I, taxpayer, the banks are making a lot of money. So nobody should feel ashamed about seeking debt relief when they need it, right? When they needed help, taxpayers bailed them out. So if we the people need help, then they need to bail us out. All right. Don't feel ashamed. You should feel righteous. This is fair. It's good. You're seeking debt relief. That's great, because otherwise the banks don't pay back all these benefits that they're getting. Then it's just taxpayers doing all of this for the banks in an uncompensated way. Right? Okay. We really deserve to get something in exchange for everything that financial institutions have extracted. There's this concept in law called unjust enrichment. That happens when someone receives a benefit at the expense of another without justification, without paying for it, and without a valid reason to keep it. So you can think also as seeking debt relief when you need it as a way to take some of the compensation that is rightly owed the American taxpayer. Okay, medical institutions. Health institutions also enjoy a lot of taxpayer support. The government spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world. You'd think that, so it was $1.5 trillion, that was from 2022, just the year 2022 alone, that 1 year, $1.5 trillion. One would think that Americans would get decent, affordable medical care in exchange for that obscenely large infusion of resources, but no, we still have to pay. The average health insurance premium in 2024 was $8,951 for an individual and $25,572 for family coverage. This is on top, right, of everything the government is paying. Now, at that price, okay, so that's just what we have to pay to have insurance. But you'd think, okay, now we've got insurance, so surely that should cover my medical expenses. No, it doesn't. On top of that, we pay an average of $2,456 in out-of-pocket costs a year. That's just the average, right? But for people with an unexpected bill, it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's no wonder then that half of Americans have medical debt, and that 57% of those with debt owe over $1,000. Check out this book, Never Pay the First Bill by Michael Allen. It will tell you how to dispute your medical bills. And it will also tell you, I learned this, and I confirmed it with my own medical bills, that 80% of medical bills are overbillings and errors. If you get billed, check the billing code and compare it. Google the billing code and see what they billed you for, what they claimed happened, and what actually happened. And I bet you anything, there will be a discrepancy. I started to do this. I would get, I did put in one thing, and it was supposed to be the billing code that they had said it was for an hour-long intensive consultation. It was a 5-minute phone call, a telehealth phone call, where I said, hey, my foot still hurts. Can I have another physical therapy session? 5 minutes. And so it's huge discrepancy in what they say is happening, what's actually happening. All right, I could go on and on about that. All right, so again, we've already paid more than our fair share here. We're being abused. We're being ripped off, you guys. So don't feel ashamed to file for bankruptcy if you have a lot of medical debt. It's there for you. It's there for you. We don't get affordable medical care, but we do get bankruptcy, and we should take advantage of it. All right, nobody should have to sacrifice basic needs to repay medical bills. Even if they were fair, actually, right? So, I mean, they're not fair. Okay. Finally, third reason not to be ashamed, default is often efficient. Again, Americans have long been denied a more robust social safety net and meaningful regulation on the grounds of economic efficiency, the view that we are all better off if everyone simply pursues their own wealth maximizing interests. Of course, there's a lot of flaws with this reasoning, but if we are told that economic efficiency should be our priority, then why should we be ashamed if we make an efficient choice about debts? So if you have a lower middle income individual with $100,000 in medical and credit card debt, no non-exempt assets, there is absolutely no reason to repay the debt instead of filing for bankruptcy. It gets technical as to when it makes sense and when it doesn't. But basically, most Americans who need bankruptcy do not have any assets to protect. Our laws protect certain assets from creditors. Most assets that Americans have are going to be exempt from creditors. So it's the efficient choice, usually, to file for bankruptcy. Yeah, and where do all these efficiency lovers go when it comes to regular Americans with debt burdens? Rather than a hearty congratulations for having exercised efficient choice, they receive a helping of shame for having acted strategically, even when, as is often the case, they did not incur the debt voluntarily, much less strategically, but simply had no choice but to incur debt in order to receive medical care or make ends meet. So, all right, in closing, financial institutions, debt collectors, and the health industry know that Americans have the right to a number of non-payment strategies, including debt relief and bankruptcy. So these institutions rely on shame and fear in order to keep us from accessing the benefits to which we are entitled. So I want not only to inspire individuals to use bankruptcy and debt to survive and thrive, but I really also am looking for some collective, creative debt disobedience to generate real change. I no longer pay my medical bills. I'm boycotting the medical system. So far, I have not been sued because actually it's not that hard. Just say, I'm not paying this, I don't know this, stop bothering me, or you're violating the FDCPA, and they go away. I can't guarantee if it happens, I'll show up in court and I'll say the same thing and I'll let you know what happens. But mostly they leave you alone. Because they send it to the debt collector is getting pennies on the dollar anyways, it's expensive for them to go to court. All right. The Debt Collective is a cool debt resistance organization. Widespread strategic debt choices might force the change that is otherwise not forthcoming. If people start using debt and bankruptcy strategically, perhaps this will force the debt policy changes for which we have long been futilely begging. It may become more cost-effective for institutions and the government to do the right thing rather than rip people off, and maybe we can transition into a less absurd socioeconomic reality. But even if institutions and governments continue to fail us, we will get some crucial practice in developing and deploying creative and imaginative strategies toward collective liberation. Thank you. Oh, I think I'm okay with moderating. Maybe you can help me out if there's anybody. Yeah, actually, can you do it?
Yeah.
Too many. I see all the hands. Now I don't know who to pick first. Okay.
Should be a better host.
No, that's okay.
I'll just ask that if you are going to ask a question, and if you are able, we have a microphone in the center there. If you could make your way to it and ask your question there. The reason being that we're recording this, and on the recording, if you're not speaking into the microphone, people who hear the recording won't be able to hear you. So, Michael, I think you might have to turn it on.
Hello? I think that works. Hi, thank you. I was just really curious on your last point that you kind of made of how you don't, let's say in your case, you don't pay your medical bills. What would you say would happen to our like health insurance, and let's say, or not rather health insurance, but our entire medical system if individuals just stop?
If everyone stopped paying, the whole thing would fall apart and we'd have to create something new.
Okay. And is that where like the abolitionist idea?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we are in an absolutely horrible situation here. I don't know what else to do. I cannot, this is not sustainable. And it'd probably be incredibly painful, and probably people would suffer, and probably some of that suffering would be a result of the collapse, but I don't think we can continue with what we're doing here. I think we need something new.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Probably a little bit bridging off of the last comment. I see a revolutionary approach to bringing down the medical institution, maybe is the only feasible way to get to universal health care within our country, or something like that. But I'm thinking so the apostolic canons, right, the first legal code of the church prohibits usury, denotes it as a terrible sin, right? And that's for this human dignity that you spoke about in the beginning of your talk. And actually, really, it says it's for a societal dignity. But likewise, in that same canon, it talks how the refusal to pay back money owed has that same inherent violation of societal dignity. And I understand that these are private lenders who are all charging usury. But do you think that in this strategic debt relinquishment, right, that there's any level of that lack of societal dignity's respect?
I mean, the problem is that this is where I think there is a risk with the term dignity when it gets into honor and respectability. This is why I like this thing about like thinking of it, like we're created in God's image, we're creators. That like the idea that it's about respect and honor is a problem, because then they can step on our faces and demand chivalry from us, right? If they were respectful to us, right? If our institutions treated us actually with dignity, if they treated us like human beings with creative potential, if they treated us the way that I would expect humans should be treated, then we could have this idea that, okay, repayment is fair, but that's not what we have. We have such this. I love that you asked this question. I love that you asked this question, because that's actually where I think if I am going to continue with dignity, for a while I was like, maybe I should just throw dignity out as a concept altogether because of this problem, because they treat us without dignity, but then they say, no, you want to file for bankruptcy, you sniveling cheater, you know? So I think that as long as we are not being treated with dignity in that particular way, that we have to do something different. I don't think it applies, because I think the Bible, when it says, well, okay, repayment is required, is sort of assuming something other than the situation that we have right now.
There's no dignity being brought to the borrowers, right? There can't be reciprocal dignity there, and this is where the shame is coming in?
I think I think I might put it that way, yeah. And I think also, again, it has to do with a little bit shifting what the sort of broadening, expanding the concept of dignity in general, rather than being sort of respectable, right? I want to talk about a flourishing, and if they have not, so what I'm saying here is that it's not enough to say, well, our terms were not abusive, right? That's not enough. If you have no choice but to take on debt in order to meet your very basic needs, right? I don't believe that debt is just. We should not have a system in which people can't go where they please and get resources. This whole thing about, I think Jesus was cool. And I think that if you look at what Jesus did, right, had a lot to do with, we need to share. This idea that, you can't come on my land and you can't fish in this stream, I don't think Jesus would be cool with that. So basically what I'm saying is that until we have a system in which people don't have to turn to debt to survive, then it is consistent with the biblical ideas of dignity for debt resistance to happen.
Very well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
First off, thank you very much for coming out. I really appreciate your talk. It was very interesting. But first and foremost, so you talked about this concept of survival debt and exploitive debt. There's also, I feel like, a third category in which it's more opportunistic debt.
Yes, that's actually in there. Sorry, I didn't elaborate. Yes.
Like a debt that people can use to, get things that they want or obtain just for personal pleasure. So would you advocate for the elimination or the non-repayment of that? And if so, wouldn't that be the abdication of personal responsibility in terms of their fiscal means? Like, there's a lot of goods and services that people want to have because they think it's like the shiniest new thing. Like the shiniest new car. People are like, I want to buy this car because the company's telling me that it's good. But in fact, their current model is perfectly just fine. But out of their own personal desire and greed, they choose to obtain and take on this debt because no other reason than just personal pleasure.
Yeah, okay,
How
so
is that not abdicating
great.
personal
All right, I love this.
responsibility?
I'm glad you asked it because I forgot to do my whole taxonomy thing because I wanted to get to my debt resistance thing. All right, so my taxonomy is actually you have debt that you need to survive, and then you also have debt that you need for opportunity, that is just for opportunity, right? Home, education, but oftentimes there's overlap, right? Because sometimes you're getting a degree because you can't get a living wage without a degree, or sometimes you're getting a home because you need a place to freaking live, right? So there is overlap between what is survival and what is opportunity. Then you also have, is the debt extractive or is it not extractive? So my thing is that the debt that I want an abolitionist approach towards, that I'd like to see made obsolete, is any debt that is necessary that the person has to take on to survival, has no choice other than to take it on, and also anything that is extractive, so anything predatory. That leaves opportunity debts, which is sort of the types of things you're describing, that is not extractive. So if you could choose not to take on the debt, and the terms are not extractive, I have no problem with the existence of that. So that's the debt that remains. I don't have a problem with that. I do, however, believe that we need to have a reparative approach there, right, because of our legacy of racism and many other things, that it can't just say, the playing field is level. There actually has to be situations in which, when it comes to opportunities, that there is not just loans made available to people that have historically been excluded from those opportunities, but actually like direct resources.
So just a quick follow-up. So it's only the services and goods that you would deem essential to the promotion of human life, like healthcare, housing, and such, that qualify underneath this.
Well, how I said it was that if it is debt how did I find it again? Debt that is it does not necessarily just the basics, but debt that is necessary in order to have a life without degradation or fear. So basic, a little bit bigger than just very basic needs, right? Basically to have a dignified human life. Any debt that is essential for a dignified human life. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question was actually on a similar line, but kind of going off of that, how would you separate opportunistic debt from survival debt? How would you draw a distinctive line?
There is no way to draw like a super clear line, right? Because it's going to be fuzzy in a lot of situations, right? So some people, you could say, right now you're a bartender. Technically, you can meet your needs. So you're going to college because you want to, make a little more. Is that survival debt? Is it opportunity debt? You know, the reality is that it's probably it's overlap. It's both survival, maybe, depending on the level of dignity that you have as a bartender. But you know, maybe it also obviously is opportunity. So I still include like any college as opportunity debt. It's just that it may also be survival debt. So there's overlap. Most graduate degrees can be purely opportunity debt, but not always. I mean, you know, I don't have like a lot of people that graduate and then they can't get a job. So then they maybe need a graduate degree in order to survive. So again, just that question of like, is this something that you basically are required to do in order to have a dignified life? If so, then we're going to put it in the category of survival debt. I would like to see people able to survive without being required to become indebted. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, so I was listening to some of your tips about, you know, fighting the cycle of debt, things like, you know, the I don't owe it, you can't prove it, maybe not paying your medical bills or not worrying too much about your credit score. And I was just wondering if you thought that maybe that can get to a point where you end up in an endless cycle of debt that you can't break free of, especially if you're relying on bankruptcy. And I think it gets to a point where maybe it's more of a personal issue than an issue with the system.
I love this because guess what? You get to file for bankruptcy every 8 years. So it's not an endless cycle.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that it would be smart if someone's still in debt, constantly filing for bankruptcy, that's...
If they have to, if they have no choice, I think it's very smart. I'd rather that than have them, people do all kinds of, I should include this in the talk. It's in the book. People who need bankruptcy wait so long to get it. They go without food. They go without necessary medication. They don't take their kid to the doctor when their kid needs to go to the doctor. Their utilities get shut off. People will suffer so much because they're so ashamed. I want them to stop doing that. I want people to take the debt they need to survive and not feel ashamed. And if they need bankruptcy every 8 years, they should take their bankruptcy every 8 years.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it is my understanding that your argument, of course, is primarily focused on debt resistance in general, and I appreciate you proposing a revolutionary solution to the financial issues that the current health system causes for most Americans. The health system has a foundation in capitalist values that are seen across many sectors of American life, and so I just wanted to hear your opinion that is more brought into like how you said it's also seen in the educational system and perhaps even the judicial system as well, many other aspects of American life. I was wondering how you might see a revolution in the health system, how that would impact these other sectors of American life.
I love this question so much. When I wrote this book, in that book, I say, well, capitalism, maybe it can work. Maybe because we just haven't really tried it with doing like major redistribution, and I don't believe that anymore. I think capitalism has failed, and I think that these institutions that we have. I work at a university. You guys are at a university. I'm sorry to say this, but I think our university systems are really broken. I'm like, it cannot be the case that it has to cost this much to get an education. It doesn't make any sense. Even my students are public students, and they still graduate law school with hundreds of $1,000s of debt. And most of them, it's not like they all go to fancy firms. It's Rutgers. They work, they make, anyways, maybe the median income, but then they have all this debt. So, I'm like, gosh, I wish I could get together with 10 of my friends and like start something where it's like, well, if there's 10 of us, we could like meet in libraries and teach the basic classes, and students could pay like $10,000 a year, and if they could pay it, then great. But if not, most of us like have saved up, people my age saved up enough to be able to like live minimally for a few years, and then once they start making money, they can pay back, but only after they have a living wage. So I like have these visions of like totally different ways to do education, where it's not so much like administrative bloat and everything, and it's just I don't think it has to be this way, but it requires like I believed in these institutions. I went to freaking law school, and I'm like, I believed in human rights institutions. those are not, they're not working, they're failing. Our institutions are failing. And I don't know, I wanted to believe in reform. I worked my butt off at my institution to try to be like, let's do this differently, let's do this differently. Try to organize so many people to be like, let's fight this, let's fight that. And it's just not working. So I'm kind of like, well, it seems like everything is collapsing, but the silver lining is that now we have no choice. We're going to have to be brave and weird and just do things totally differently. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I personally am joining my neighborhood mutual aid group. I used to be so down on mutual aid because I'm like, why should people that don't have very much have to support each other? Like, we have enough wealth to do redistribution. I'm just not counting on institutions anymore. So I'm doing very hyper-local. We help each other with food. We help each other with medicine. We do our own stuff. And we help each other survive. And so I think like that's probably going to have to be what it is. There's a lot more people doing hyper-local stuff to support each other. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. How do you think new forms of debt, like buy now, pay later, kind of change the system and affect people differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like sort of more of the same problem. There's just, I don't know if it's different so much as just a different mechanism for it, right? There's just, it's proliferating. And as our economy gets increasingly stupider, we're not really actually making anything. The companies, right, every company, in order to make money, they do two things. They get us in debt, and they sell our data for marketing purposes, right? So the more that they have nothing interesting to sell us, they have to manipulate us more, encourage us to take on more debt. So buy now, pay later is like a great way. Like, well, this product is probably stupid, but the few people that buy it at least can pay over time, and then we can get some interest out of them that way. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you all.
Yeah, if there's no further questions. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.